and to share something about this really important topic around agriculture and the role that Abdu'l-Baha played. I don't know if everybody here knows who Abdu'l-Baha is and why we should care what he has to say, but I guess as we go along, we'll explain it. But basically, he was the son of the founder of the Baha'i faith. Baha'u'llah was the founder of the Baha'i faith. Abdu'l-Baha was his son. And after his father passed in 1892 till 1921, Abdu'l-Baha was the head of the Baha'i faith and was an extraordinary figure. And so I'll just go into my slideshow here, and we'll see what we can learn about him. Okay. So one of the titles of Abdu'l-Baha, Abdu'l-Baha actually means the servant of Baha'u'llah. Abdul is servant, but Baha'u'llah called him the master. So often Baha'is refer to Abdu'l-Baha as the master. And in a sense, I think he's also the master of social action and public discourse, which is one of the are two of the areas that the Baha'i community is moving into. So just before we kind of go into that, I just wanted to sort of set the stage a little bit by talking about this question of world order and the condition it's in. And this is an image taken from Syria, and it had a big impact on me when I saw it, because it looked to me almost like a some kind of dystopian movie, but it's an actual scene in Syria. And there's some discussion of this war, the horrible civil war that's still going on in Syria, and how it was really triggered in many ways by a situation where farmers, about 1 million farmers, had to move off the land in Syria due to drought, which is connected to climate change, and poured into cities, and it kind of upset the balance and triggered this big conflict that's happening there. So it's one of the indications that our world order is defective, as Baha'u'llah said many years ago. There we go. So Baha'u'llah said, the winds of despair are alas blowing from every direction, and the strife that divideth and afflicteth the human race is daily increasing. So I think that, this year in particular, 2020, I think this is becoming more evident all the time on multiple levels. I mean, obviously there's the pandemic that's happening, but also kind of a growing consciousness of inequalities of various kinds related to race and gender and class and nationality and so on. And he says the signs of impending convulsions and chaos cannot be discerned inasmuch as the prevailing order appeareth to be lamentably defective. So Baha'u'llah pointed out that all of these things we're facing have to do with the actual order, the way the world is organized, how it's defective and it's triggering these problems. So I beseech God that he may graciously awaken the peoples of the earth, may grant that the end of their conduct may be profitable unto them, and aid them to accomplish that which beseemeth their station. So he's calling on people to really transform their lives and transform the world order. And then he says, is not the object of every revelation to effect a transformation in the whole character of mankind, transforming a transformation that shall manifest itself both outwardly and inwardly, that shall affect both its inner life and external conditions. So Baha'u'llah talks about this defective world order and how the role of religion is really to transform that into a new order by changing us both internally and externally. So in the Baha'i community, worldwide Baha'i community, we talk about how to take steps to transformation, and there is a systematic plan in place to do that. So those of us who are involved in this know about this idea of there being 3 protagonists in this process. There are individuals, each of us. There are communities, which are more than the sum of the individuals in them, and there are institutions of various kinds. And all of these players, protagonists, have to be involved in this process of transformation. And there are three areas of action. One is a process of building capacity at the level of communities, at the level of neighborhoods and villages. I think capacity within individuals, but also within communities and institutions to become agents of change. And I think once a bit of capacity is built, then we're looking at how can we then take action on a larger scale to bring about change and also become involved in public discourse. So these are three areas of action in this systematic plan to help transform the world, to do our part in that process. So we're engaging in Baha'i communities all over the world in something like 5,000 geographic clusters in the set of activities that help to build unity and capacity through educational processes. Engaging in social action, really beginning at a very small scale, often involving things like gardens and kids working on growing things and improving our environment. And also engaging in public discourse. So that could happen at the level of a conversation with friends, or engaging at the highest levels of society, governments, international agencies, and so on, to really kind of change the way we think about the world and how it needs to be shaped. And the Universal House of Justice, the head of the Baha'i Faith, the council that's at the head of the Baha'i Faith, talks about this process having the potential to disable every instrument devised by humanity over the long period of its childhood for one group to oppress another. So very, very relevant to the situation that's happening in the world now in terms of inequalities of various kinds. Now, when we talk about Abdu'l-Baha, we talk about him as our exemplar. So he is considered the example of how Baha'is should act. And when we look at the question of public discourse and social action, he really was a master of these actions. And so we'll talk about that. One of the things that, in terms of public discourse, is incredible amount of written material. And there are something like 30,000 tablets. And a tablet is really maybe a letter or an article that he would have written and shared and sent to people around the world. And I was thinking, because I'm a writer, I was thinking about these 30,000 tablets and what was really involved in writing those. And at the beginning was mentioned that I published 1,600 articles. So I thought, oh, that's pretty good for the resume. But I was trying to think of how that compares to Abdu'l-Baha's output. So I wrote one article a week for 27 years. And that comes out to something like 1,500 or so. So if I was super prolific and wrote an article every day of the week, let's say 5 articles a week, that would be 7,500 articles over 27 years. So Abdu'l-Baha wrote 4 times that many. So it would have taken me one article per weekday, would have taken me 108 years to produce what Abdu'l-Baha produced, or one article a day for 82 years. So really it's quite incredible, but you got to realize that what Abdu'l-Baha was producing was material of this great profundity. I mean, some of them were small things. They might be a letter of thanking people for some kind of contribution, but many were these profound treatises on every aspect of life. And he also wrote 3 books, The Secret of Divine Civilization, Memorials of the Faithful, and a treatise on politics, which were, again, very profound, at least in 2 cases, explanations of how to reorganize the world. So incredible output. Meanwhile, he was also involved in this huge verbal discourse in international travels. He traveled throughout North Africa, Europe, and also North America, Canada, and the United States, giving talks. And my wife just recently been reading Mahmoud's diary, and she was just telling me the incredible pace that Abdu'l-Baha worked at, meeting, giving talks, meeting people, speaking to the press, and so on. So really a remarkable achievement, unparalleled in a sense, I think, in this engagement in public discourse. So that was one of the things he did. And another thing was to be engaged in social action, which is more what we'll be talking about today. Now, his social action really took place at a number of levels. His personal activities in care of the poor and disadvantaged in Akka, providing financial support, feeding and bathing the sick. The Arabs called him the Lord of Generosity. That one quote says that he goes about doing good, and Mohammedans and Christians alike share his benefactions. From sunrise, often until midnight, he works in spite of broken health, never sparing himself if there is a wrong to be righted or a suffering to be relieved. So this is his day-to-day work in social action, assisting people in his community. Now, meanwhile, he was guiding the Baha'is in Iran. There he fostered the social development of the community. He encouraged the Baha'is to set up schools and medical facilities and promoted the role of women in the community. Interestingly, Baha'i women achieved close to 100% literacy compared to the general population of 25%, even in 1976, and around 80% today. Meanwhile, in the Baha'i community of Ashgabat near in Turkmenistan, was freer to develop a distinctively Baha'i community than the friends were in Iran. Here, Abdu'l-Baha encouraged the Baha'is to set up a number of institutions, schools, a clinic, a traveler's hospice, library and reading room, and public baths. This all culminated in the building between 1902 and 1919 of the first Mashriq al-Adkar, which is the first Baha'i temple in the world. With Abdu'l-Baha's encouragement, the Baha'is of Ashgabat attained as close as it was possible to achieve, at that time, the ideal of a Baha'i community. So now let's consider that all of this, or at least from the age of 9 to 64, he was an exile and a prisoner, much of the time under constant threat of execution. At the same time, continuous efforts to undermine his authority by members of his family who were jealous. His personal life was very simple, and his furnishings of his room were very Spartan, but he was also receiving pilgrims who were starting to come from around the world. Often he would actually cook for them himself. He was also engaged in building the shrine of the Bab, one of the founders of the Baha'i faith, creating the world center of the Baha'i faith, actively encouraging the beautification of the shrines. He would himself, they talk about him bringing soil in his cloak and helping to build the gardens himself. At the same time, he was administering an emerging world religion and expansion throughout the world. And during his ministry, the Baha'i faith spread to Australia, New Zealand, China, Japan, South Africa, South America, and the islands of the Pacific. He was also constantly managing relationships with governments, which were very difficult at that time. And one indication of his impact just in his local community alone was when he passed away in 1921, 10,000 people attended his funeral. So what I wanted to talk about mainly today, I felt I should set that background before I talk about this one particular project that he was involved in, which is very relevant even today to the transformation of agriculture. And it's really a model achievement, I think, in sustainable regenerative social economic development. And that is this community in Adasiyyah, which is now in Jordan. So the material I found on this is developed by Raj Pushti. Perhaps some of you know him. He's passed away now, but he was an agronomist originally from Iran who lived in Britain. And he wrote a really amazing chapter in the book Spirit of Agriculture, which I edited, about the activities of the central figures of the faith, the Bab, Baha'u'llah, and Abdu'l-Baha in the agricultural and rural development areas. And later he wrote this very excellent essay on this community of Adasiyyah, which is a study of a model of agricultural and rural development. So these are just some Google Earth images that I found, which kind of give us an idea of where Adasiyyah is, which is, you can see it here just south of the Sea of Galilee. In 1901, Abdu'l-Baha purchased the lands of Adasiyyah as a whole village state, paying 400 Turkish gold lira. The original area purchased was 920 hectares. However, Abdu'l-Baha immediately gave away 230 hectares, leaving a total of 690 hectares. The village was developed in several phases. At first, Abdu'l-Baha made arrangements for several farmers to begin the work, but they found it very difficult due to the poor conditions of the land and the heavy labor required. What is more, they were subject to raids by thieves who stole whatever meager crop they were able to produce. In 1907, recognizing these obstacles, Abdu'l-Baha contacted the Baha'is in Persia and asked them to send experienced farmers to settle in Adasiyyah. Over the next couple of years, a group of farmers from around Yaz began to arrive and commenced farm operations. Abdu'l-Baha informed them, the farmers, that they were coming to one of the most inhospitable places on earth. I thought that was interesting, that how transparent Abdu'l-Baha was about what these people were getting themselves into. In the Jordan Valley, the heat is stifling from June to September, with an average daily temperature around 38 degrees Celsius. Malaria was a significant problem. While the land had once been fertile and supported a large population, agriculture in the region had fallen into decline under Ottoman rule. Abdu'l-Baha told them that God would gradually make the climate of Adasiyyah more comfortable merely for the sake of the Baha'i farmers in Iran. So that was his prediction, and we'll see what happened. These farmers would overcome many obstacles to implement the projects planned and directed by Abdu'l-Baha. At first, hand labor with simple tools was used to prepare the land, but gradually draft animals and plows were added. They also had to build homes to provide for the basic needs of their families. And these other buildings were initially made from mud bricks. Interesting that the land was covered with thorn bushes. So of course this made this work much harder. Before the farmers started cultivation, Abdu'l-Baha instructed them to meet, consult, and then divide the land amongst themselves. Gradually, the friends began to prosper. Precipitation was sufficient to support rain-fed grain production, and Abdu'l-Baha recommended that the farmers begin by planting wheat and barley. Often the farmers visited Haifa or Akka to seek Abdu'l-Baha's advice. He would have a specific recommendation for that season, assuring them of a bumper harvest and great bounty. An important characteristic of the Jordan Valley is a year-round growing season, making double cropping feasible. Over time, the farmers were able to become quite productive and to produce surplus grain. Although some raiding continued to occur, security was improved by building bonds of friendship in the wider community, an activity Abdu'l-Baha had insisted on. During the First World War, when drought conditions added to the disruption caused by the fighting, Abdu'l-Baha foresaw famine. He went to the farmers in Adasiyyah and asked them to empty their granaries, accepting the amount needed for their own use and for reseeding. He also asked them to purchase grain from farmers in the area. A train of 200 camels was dispatched to Haifa and Akka, where the grain was distributed amongst the local population, preventing starvation. This humanitarian effort resulted in Abdu'l-Baha being knighted by the British, who had gained control of Palestine during the war. He accepted the honor as the gift of a just king, but never used the title. The farmers' initial success opened new horizons. Abdu'l-Baha encouraged them to diversify their crops, and as early as 1910, they expanded into vegetable production for their families and for the market. Next, Abdu'l-Baha encouraged the farmers to add fruit trees. It was customary to plant broad beans between them and around pomegranate trees. So, some were used fresh or dried for human consumption, but a large part of the crop was plowed into the soil while still green to improve soil texture and fertility. Abdu'l-Baha also introduced bananas to the region. Until that time, no one in the region knew anything about this crop, let alone how to grow it. At first, the villagers were even unsure how to eat it, finding it quite unpalatable and hard to swallow, until they were shown that the outer skin must be removed. Within a few years, many farmers in the region were growing bananas and profited greatly from this relatively lucrative business. Gradually, Abdu'l-Baha's prediction of improving conditions came true. In the early years, malaria was rampant. Some of the Baha'is developed the disease and even succumbed to it. To address the problem, Abdu'l-Baha instructed the community to plant a certain type of eucalyptus around the lagoon in the middle of Adasiyyah. This variety produced quinine in its leaves and branches, which acts as a deterrent to the malarial parasite. The trees grew quickly, sucking up large quantities of the mosquito-infested water. Along with the diversification of crops, Abdu'l-Baha encouraged additional methods to improve the productivity and sustainability of the farm, such as crop rotations. In addition to the use of nitrogen-fixing legumes in rotation, manure was added to increase the yield of crops. Abdu'l-Baha encouraged the Friends in Adasiyyah to diversify into livestock. The Baha'i farmers were almost self-sufficient in terms of their own food needs. However, Abdu'l-Baha advised them to increase their income by selling products in markets beyond the immediate boundaries of Jordan. A key to increasing the diversity of crops and improving yields was irrigation. The community worked together to build a small dam across a portion of the river Yarmouk and collaborated to dig and maintain irrigation channels. Eventually, tractors and electric lighting were introduced. Abdu'l-Baha advised the villagers to engage in crafts and small industries. Many farmers were also artisans, and a good number of them worked as part-time carpenters, while most of the women were engaged in needlework, dressmaking, and millinery. Along with the gradually improving farming operation, Abdu'l-Baha encouraged spiritual and social aspects of village life. Problems such as those related to tenancy, transfer of the right of production, and share of irrigation water, as well as interpersonal conflicts, are bound to arise in any village setting. When the Baha'i farmers sought Abdu'l-Baha's advice regarding these matters, he would smile and suggest that they should sit down and pray together, consult on the resolution of the problems, and ensure that the unity of the community was maintained no matter what. The conditions of peasants, sharecroppers, and small farmers in 19th century Jordan under the rule of the Ottoman Empire was wretched. The peasantry was liable to rapacious profiteering by landlords. Adasiyyah was a different story. The system of crop and animal production was based on a special type of sharecropping tendency that was both innovative and fair. Abdu'l-Baha emphasized the application of moral and spiritual values in day-to-day life and farm work. These values had a significant influence on the production and marketing systems of the farmers, improving their fortunes. Furthermore, he strongly recommended that they establish warm bonds of friendship with the people they met or had business dealings with, and conduct all their affairs with high rectitude of conduct. In view of this great interest in rural and agricultural development, Abdu'l-Baha would occasionally visit the village himself. At its peak, there were around 1,000 people in the village and surrounding area. The first spiritual assembly of the Baha'is of Adasiyyah was elected in 1924 to direct the affairs of the community. All matters relating to farming and animal production, including allotments of land, were discussed and conducted by a farming committee working under the auspices of the assembly. A spacious two-story building erected and completed in 1931 was dedicated for use as a local Baha'i administrative center, or Hazrat al-Quds. In the early days, the education of the children took place at home. In the evenings, the Baha'is, irrespective of age, attended literary classes. Adasiyyah soon became an agricultural showcase for the whole of Jordan. If the government wished to show how advanced it was in agricultural production and farming techniques, it would bring foreign guests and dignitaries to Adasiyyah, a brilliant star in an otherwise semi-arid scrubland. Even members of the royal family visited the village. Ultimately, due to Jordanian land reforms in the 1960s, the Baha'is were not able to continue to live in Adasiyyah and moved to other areas or even other countries to support the worldwide growth of the Baha'i faith. However, the principles and practices of village life and farming initiated by Abdu'l-Baha in the village still offer a relevant example of just, productive, and sustainable rural development application to 1/3 of humanity, the smallholder farmers, produce much of the world's food. In fact, the development principles followed by Abdu'l-Baha addressed a range of social and ecological concerns that have since intensified. The redevelopment of Adasiyyah accomplished three things that, if replicated, would greatly contribute to the development of rural areas and the world. Yeah, I just wanted to point out that, I've often found it interesting that the Baha'i faith is the first faith to be established in the kind of industrial era. But I wanted to point out how relevant, the Baha'i faith focuses a lot of attention on farming and agriculture and food, perhaps more than any other religion. And I always found that interesting juxtaposition. But I just thought it's worth looking at this, how farming remains the largest single occupation in the world, with 1/3 of humanity, about 2.5 billion farmers and their families deriving their livelihoods from agriculture. That there are about 500 million farms worldwide. Most of them very small farms, and also 200 million pastoralists and 450 million farm laborers. Also, a lot of people derive at least some of their subsistence or income from forests, including many indigenous people. So many more people involved in this relationship with the land in this category as well. Also, another 58 million people are engaged in fisheries and aquaculture. And interestingly, as many as 800 million people are involved in urban and peri-urban food production around the world. So I think that I mentioned three things that we can learn from Adasiyyah. The first one is about ecological and climate services. With the encouragement of Abdu'l-Baha, the community of Adasiyyah restored degraded, eroded, and deforested land, improved soil quality, improved water use efficiency, and increased crop diversity, including the use of perennial tree crops and forages. Today, this approach, which requires minimum external inputs, is known as agroecology, an effort to farm in a manner that mimics the functions of the natural ecosystem. And also the area of social economic development. The initial capital investment by Abdu'l-Baha was the catalyst that allowed families in Adasiyyah to prosper. They were able to transform scrubland into productive farms and eventually supported hundreds of residents and contributed to the local and regional economy. The farms provided high quality food for the village and urban areas. The generous sharecropping arrangement and profit sharing improved the standard of living of residents and non-resident farm laborers. And I thought this is so interesting in that these methods that Abdu'l-Baha adopted are very relevant today, when about 3.5 billion hectares of land around the world are degraded, desertified, deforested, and that's an area about the size of the continent of Africa. And if we can help, as Abdu'l-Baha did in this case, support the rural poor to restore land, this would lead to the elimination of extreme poverty and hunger, increase the Earth's biocapacity, and help to ameliorate climate change. There's a lot of work been done by the soil scientist Ratan Lal, who recently received the World Food Prize, about the potential for restoring soils on small farms being a key to ameliorating climate change. And this would also avoid this problem, which we looked at the very beginning with the case of Syria, of mass migrations of people resulting from this kind of massive ecological and climate change situation happening in different countries. And restoring that amount of land by helping these 2.5 billion people who are involved in small-scale farming would be the equivalent of creating a new continent the size of Africa, potentially. So the third area was the area of moral capacity. Material self-reliance brings a sense of dignity, and Abdu'l-Baha went further, encouraging the residents of Adasiyyah to pay equal attention to their moral development. This was achieved through education, both material and spiritual, for the children, the youth, and adults, and through regular devotional meetings. Education supported a dual moral purpose: to develop the potentialities of the individual and to enhance their capacity to be of service. Building this capacity helped community members to live harmoniously. A local governing institution was elected to administer the material and spiritual needs of the community. In this way, the moral capacity of the individual, the community, and the institutions increased. So it's no wonder that when Abdu'l-Baha passed, he had gained the respect. He came to this prison city as an exile prisoner, hated by the people there, and eventually won over the entire population. This is a picture of his funeral with 10,000 people, and I would imagine at that time in 1921 that would be almost all the people of this community. So, and today, as you probably know, many of you will know that a shrine is being built to Abdu'l-Baha near Akka, where he lived. And this is an example or a picture of the shrine that's being built. Now, I thought I'd include at the end here some examples from around the world of people following in the footsteps of the master and trying to put in place some Baha'i-inspired agricultural projects. This is one which we featured in the book, The Spirit of Agriculture, which was in Mongolia, where the Baha'is there were working with the population to grow more vegetables to improve people's nutrition. I thought it was interesting that back in 1928, Richard St. Barbe Baker, who was a new Baha'i, who was inspired by Abdu'l-Baha, worked in Kenya and in Nigeria. This is when he was working in Benin, consulting with local people about methods of farming that were not dissimilar from what Abdu'l-Baha was doing in Adasiyyah, developing a kind of permaculture approach using agroforestry to preserve landscapes and increase people's incomes. Another great project in Fundayak, which is an NGO in Colombia. For over 30 years, they've been fostering a process of learning and training and development in rural Colombia, which is spread around to different areas of Latin America. They've created rural educational systems that reaches more than 20,000 students dispersed through different areas, including many native ethnic groups. And here's just an example of an experimental plot at the University Center for Rural Wellbeing, operated by Fundayak in Colombia. Another example is the Barley Development Institute for Rural Women, started in 1985 by the Baha'is in India. They've completed 105 residential training programs for 6,700 young women from 600 villages who go back to their villages and help in the development of their communities. I like this. This is a recent one that came out of the local spiritual assembly of Motabasti in Nepal, looking at what it can do to enhance the community's capacity to produce its own food. And this is in response to the pandemic, which has, I guess, a lot of agricultural workers lost their jobs and had to come back to their community. So the community was concerned about this food crisis, increasing price of goods and other issues such as children's education. And then they consulted together about how to move forward and how to help these migrant workers find land that wasn't being used in the community to grow crops and be able to make a living. So you see where spiritual assemblies can become involved, very much like they did in Adasiyyah, in resolving their own problems. most of these things, projects we're seeing that are quite exciting are happening in these low-income countries, Latin America, South Asia, Africa, but also more projects are happening in countries like the United States and Canada and Europe, where people are using agriculture, urban agriculture, to develop friendship and cooperation within their communities, as well as growing food. So this is a garden in Charlotte, North Carolina, that's done quite a good job of connecting people in the community. I always like to point to this project. Austin Bowden Kirby started coral restoration projects with villagers, fishing villages in Fiji and other small island nations, and now becoming engaged in kind of whole of watershed projects, going up the watershed, up into the hills and mountains, and looking at how to improve agriculture so that there isn't a lot of erosion into the coastal areas. And so they're rebuilding coral reefs by selecting corals that are more resistant to bleaching and helping to restore fishing in that way. Another Baha'i-inspired project, the Smallholder Farmers in Alliance in Haiti, that use tree currency to pay people with trees and to reform their methods of farming and build stronger communities, and really getting excellent results there as well. Now, having helped about 13,000 people in their communities to improve their lives. So these are just examples of communities, I think, that are following in the footsteps of the master. This one I thought was very interesting was how when the local house of worship was built, I think one of the first two local houses of worship, this one in Norte del Cauco in Colombia, the community decided to, in conjunction with building this house of worship, which is a center of worship and service together, they decided to restore a native forest and consulted with some of the elders there about how they could do that, and built this native forest around the temple area. So just another example. And I think that is it. This is a visual of the area around Adasiyyah today. I actually went there one time, some time ago. We couldn't go into the village at the time, but you can see how the landscape, the agricultural part of the landscape, has been restored in the area compared to the surrounding hills and so on. So the original article, which is very detailed and can give you much more information, by Raj Pushti, here's a link to it. I went on research. I think the best way is just to Google the name Adasiyyah, Study in Agriculture and Rural Development. And you can get the full story that Arash wrote, which is really excellent. So that's what I have to share. I hope that worked for you folks. And